We have identified what our priorities are, and they are clearly articulated in Agenda 2063. We have just adopted the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, and we are not going to be distracted by geopolitical dynamics. Yes, they are there. Yes, these are realities, but one of the major decisions that has been taken is for us to be self-sufficient in the production of fertilizer. And here the African private sector is coming in. We have the natural resources to produce fertilizer. So we have entrepreneurs like Aliko Dangote, who is now investing huge amounts of resources to establish fertilizer plants in various African countries, so that we are not going to pay the kind of price that we've paid when the war started in Ukraine, and now with the disruption of the global value chains as a result of what is going on in Iran. So we have to ensure that we have that level of reliance on the continent, and we are galvanizing and mobilizing the African private sector to come in and invest, so that we have what is required in terms of technology, fertilizers, and other productive systems that are needed to ensure that our food security is assured, because that is where you start. This is the basic. It's like a family. You have to be able to feed your family before you can even talk about, sending them to university or any other ambitions, because, children cannot study on empty stomachs.
Dr. Alhaji Sarjoh Bah, welcome to Inside the Continent on African Voices Radio. For the sake of our viewers who might not know you, could you please provide a brief description of yourself or your background and the experience that led you to this role?
Thank you very much. I think I bring to this position over 20 years of professional experience. My immediate past position at the African Union headquarters was Director of Conflict Management. So I was in charge of managing peace and security across the African continent. And then prior to that, I was the Deputy Head of Mission with the African Union Observer Mission in New York. That is to the United Nations. And I've held several other positions. I was, between 2012 and 2016, the AU representative to SADC, the Southern African Development Community. And in between, of course, I've done a lot of research, I've done a lot of publications, including one or two edited books and a lot of journal articles. I've been involved in a lot of high-stakes mediation on the African continent, the most notable being the Tigray Peace Agreement that brought to an end 2 years of bloody conflict in northern Ethiopia in November 2022.
Thank you very much. A vast experience indeed to lead you to this role. Ambassador Bah, as you reflect on your role since being appointed in 2025, if I'm not mistaken, it is now 8 months since you came to Beijing. What have been the key highlights and milestones of your tenure so far?
Well, I think it has been one of those situations where you literally hit the ground running. I arrived here on the 1st of September, and on the 3rd of September, I was in Tiananmen Square to witness the parade on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and Japan's aggression against China. I mean, that was quite an experience where you had 26 world leaders who attended that particular occasion. Since then, I have worked very closely with the 53 African missions that are based here in China. As your viewers are maybe aware, there are 55 AU member states. 53 of them have diplomatic ties with China, and all of them are represented here. So we've done 2 significant engagements in the past 8 months, in addition to a lot of other mid to small term engagements. The 2 major engagements was one in December, where I brought all the 53 ambassadors together and invited 3 agencies from the African Union to reflect on the interface between Agenda 2063, FOCAC, and the outcomes of the recent FOCAC in 2024. What we did in that conference is to identify any areas of synergy and cooperation in order to ensure that we align Agenda 2063 with the FOCAC outcomes. And then just last month, you are aware that on the 1st of May, the zero tariff came into force for all the 53 member states. And I then convened also a strategic reflection session where we had a retreat of the 53 ambassadors, and I invited the AFCFTA Secretariat in Accra, I invited Auda Nepad from South Africa and the Department of Trade, where we reflected on how we can organize Africa to take advantage of what is certainly a very important opportunity. But there are always opportunities, but those opportunities will have to be transformed to tangible. So we met over a 2-day period, discussed, and I think we've come up with very concrete recommendations on how we ensure that the market access that has been granted to Africa is not going to be another missed opportunity, and the outcomes of that retreat will be presented to the Executive Council, that is the meeting of the foreign ministers next month in Cairo, which we hope will be endorsed so that we can then start to talk about implementation. And the whole idea behind it is to ensure that if you look at the Chinese market, 1.4 billion. So if you want to produce for this market, scale matters. So how do we ensure that we produce at scale? Or how do we ensure that we do it in a coordinated manner so there is not a fragmented approach to the zero tariff?
You've touched on the zero tariff a little bit. I just wanted to take advantage of that, which came into effect 1 month ago, as you mentioned. And also, this year marked the 70th anniversary since the China-Africa relationship began. And most of the time, many people see the China-Africa relationship or the African relationship with other foreign countries as one-way traffic, not balanced. So you as an ambassador here in Beijing, how do you ensure that Africa gets its fair take into this relationship?
Now let's go back to the zero tariff. One of the key outcomes and the key recommendations of the retreat of the member states here in Beijing is that zero tariff is an opportunity for Africa to industrialize. And by that, the member states, or we collectively call for industrialization and modernization of our production systems. And we categorically pushed back against the idea of continuing a pattern that we had done with the West for over 200-300 years, producing raw materials that are not processed on the continent, and then we re-import the finished product at a higher price. So we are saying, let us learn from the past in order to correct and make amends for the mistakes that we have made. So collectively, there is going to be a decision where we say, yes, we want to access the Chinese market, but in order to access it, we have to ensure that we add value to the products, whether it is agricultural products, whether it is minerals, or any other products, that there is value addition on the continent, because it is only through value addition that you can get the true worth of the resources that we have. But more critically, we can create opportunities, jobs for our young men and women who, it is not a secret, the bulk of them are struggling to find reasonably well-paying jobs, or if they can find any jobs at all.
And reflecting on this 70th anniversary, what insights have emerged that you think will shape future engagements?
I think 70 years of any human endeavor is something that should be commended. So the 70th anniversary of Sino-African ties, I think, is something that we should look back on with pride, and it is anchored on two critical principles. One is the principle of solidarity, and the second one is the principle of win-win, where Africa and China wins. Now, if you look at what we have done successfully with the Chinese in the 70 years, China was very instrumental in supporting the anti-colonial struggle, especially in Southern Africa. The fight against apartheid in South Africa and the decolonization in what used to be called Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, which is today Zambia and Zimbabwe, was well supported by the Chinese, and the overall decolonization exercise on the continent. So we can look back and say we have benefited quite significantly in terms of the partnership. Then fast forward to the 90s, we have also seen some tangible benefits in terms of cooperation in the areas of infrastructure, in the areas of energy. More can be done and more will be done. So my role here is to work with our 53 member states represented here in Beijing to ensure that we scale up the level of engagement with China, so that when you say win-win, we can actually identify what a collective victory will look like for Africa in this partnership with China. Because I think for the Chinese, they have already identified what winning looks like. For us, with 53 sovereign entities, my role is how do you mediate and how do you bring those sovereign entities together to identify commonalities that will then bring collective results and collective outcomes for all of us, which we are doing. As I said, we started in December. We had another meeting last month, and we are going to continue with these engagements. The next engagement is going to be around critical minerals. As you are aware, critical minerals are the minerals of the future. Everything that is in your telephone, and even this camera that you are using, some of the parts, the components, comes from those critical minerals. And we have 40% of known deposits globally, but of course we still have deficits in terms of extracting and processing those. So I intend to convene a meeting in September, October, to reflect on how we can partner with China, which has the comparative advantage in not only extracting but also processing critical minerals, that some of these minerals are actually processed on the African continent. I think if we succeed in doing that, it's going to be a game changer, and it will transform the economic landscape of the African continent, but also our partnership with China, and it will have ripple effects on our partnerships with other parts of the world.
The phrase win-win is very popular in China, as I've been here in the last 2 years. And in terms of any deal that China does, it always describes itself, or the deals that it does, as a win-win for developing countries, including Africa. So looking at that, how do you assess the progress made in aligning Africa-China cooperation with Agenda 2063, and what areas require more focus moving forward? I know you touched on it a little bit earlier.
I think we are pushing. Is like I said earlier, you have 53 sovereign entities here. China is one country, and when you say Africa, there is always a mistake to mischaracterize Africa. The relationship between China and Africa plays at various levels. You have the bilateral, that is between China and 53 sovereign nations represented here. But then you have the African Union, which I represent, that brings together these 53 sovereign nations. So what we are doing is to ensure that the priorities identified in Agenda 2063 are properly aligned and supported by the 53 embassies here on the continent. So when we engage China, for instance, on regional infrastructure projects, on regional energy project, on regional value addition or regional value chains, that we have the full political support and buy-in of our member states. And that is happening. And when you say, where are the gaps? I think you and I know that the gaps on the continent, you have a continent with over 600 million people without access to reliable electricity. That is a gap. And it's a gap that we are determined to really address, and we are working very closely with China to address that. Infrastructure and connectivity, huge gaps on the continent that needs to be addressed if we are to really transcend and leap forward. And we don't have a choice, we have to do it. And then even the agriculture that we've been practicing for centuries is still, to a large extent, subsistence agriculture. We have to move away from that, but also we have to modernize the methods that we use in agriculture. It cannot be seasonal. You wait for the the rainy season, you plow your crops, and then you have another 6 months of waiting. That cannot be, the way you operate in a commercial setting. Even to feed the African continent, it is not viable, neither is it sustainable. So we are looking at coming up with systems that are very modern, systems that are very mechanized, so that we have irrigation systems, so you will plow and produce 12 months around the year, because you cannot depend on nature. What we are seeing with climate change, the rains are getting less and less. The deserts in the Sahara, in the Kalahari, and other parts of the continent are expanding. So we have to be able to come up with methods and systems that will allow us to have that food security that is required. Because for me, before we talk about exporting food, we have to be able to feed ourselves. So that self-sufficiency is where we start. And we have what we call the Common Agricultural Policy, CADEP, which has mandated all African countries to, in their national budgets, to allocate 10% of their national budgets to agriculture. It is happening in some member states, not across the board yet, but it's still, work in progress, and we continue to engage our member states to move in that direction. So I would say energy, infrastructure, modernizing our agricultural systems, and more critically, empowering our human resource. Any nation or any continent, your best assets are your people. So we have to be able to focus and invest the adequate resources that are required to develop our human capital to ensure that we can be very competitive, that we are competitive in all the productive sectors of a modern day economy.
In terms of what you've mentioned here, you've touched on so many challenges, and whichever a person selects, you will think that's the most challenging issue in Africa. But let's talk about food here, which is one of the most important. Looking at the global geopolitics, the way things are kind of evolving right now across the world, things are affecting Africa the most, which Africa has nothing to do with. So looking at you in your capacity or in your role, how do you navigate the shifting alliances and tensions, and what role does China play in this landscape?
I think we have identified what our priorities are, and they are clearly articulated in Agenda 2063. We have just adopted the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, and we are not going to be distracted by geopolitical dynamics. Yes, they are there. Yes, these are realities, but one of the major decisions that has been taken is for us to be self-sufficient in the production of fertilizer. And here the African private sector is coming in. We have the natural resources to produce fertilizer. So we have entrepreneurs like Aliko Dangote, who is now investing huge amounts of resources to establish fertilizer plants in various African countries, so that we are not going to pay the kind of price that we've paid when the war started in Ukraine, and now with the disruption of the global value chains as a result of what is going on in Iran. So we have to ensure that we have that level of reliance on the continent, and we are galvanizing and mobilizing the African private sector to come in and invest, so that we have what is required in terms of technology, fertilizers, and other productive systems that are needed to ensure that our food security is assured, because that is where you start. It's the basic. It's like a family. You have to be able to feed your family before you can even talk about sending them to university or any other ambitions, because children cannot study on empty stomachs. Neither can continent or a continent of 1.4 billion people make progress when there is no food security. I was in Libreville last week at our annual retreat, and one of the points I made was sustainable peace cannot be built on empty stomachs. And I think I believe that very seriously, because I have seen the effect of countries having food security. The Chinese have done it. This country 40 years ago is not where it is today. The Brazilians are moving in that direction. They are doing extremely well. And there is no reason why we can also not do that. We have 60% of the world's arable land on the African continent. We have the Congo Basin, which is the world's second long after the Amazon. And we have rivers and I think everything that is required to ensure that we have food security. So we are determined to tap on China's experience in terms of technology to ensure that there will be technology and knowledge transfer, so we can produce sufficiently in the first instance for ourselves before we then think about even exporting, because Africa on its own is a huge market, 1.4 billion, and you have a middle class of over 500 million, middle class scattered across the continent. That is bigger than the entire European Union put together.
You've touched on China and Brazil as an example, but always when they are going out in negotiation, they are going into the room as one country. And you are here representing about 53 countries, if I'm not mistaken. So how do you ensure that all these ambassadors across Africa that are here in China, you are always having the same vision and going into the room with one aim?
Well, what we've started doing and what we do, we have to disaggregate. The 53 ambassadors here are here on bilateral mandates. They're here to represent their national jurisdictions, their countries, and but it is the same 53 that have come together in the context of the African Union and adopted Agenda 2063. So if you look at the Program on Infrastructure and Development in Africa that is called PIDA, this is a program that has the full support and the legitimacy of our member states. So what we do here in China Yes, they pursue their bilateral mandates with China because those are bilateral. But when it comes to the continental mandates that are meant to foster integration of the continent, we work together and we agree on a collective strategy in terms of our engagement. We are looking at engaging China in coming up with regional corridors for energy, regional infrastructure programs, and regional value chains that will ensure that we promote the integration, because the one of the biggest deficits, if I can call that a deficit, that we have is China negotiates as one entity of 1.4 billion people. Now you look at the some of our countries, the population dynamics that are negotiating with China 1.4 billion against whatever the population of any given country is, not for me to name countries here. It tells you that the scale is not terribly balanced in their favor. So we will get a better deal if we were to come together, and we are working to do that, and then we collectively bargain as 53 member states, which is over 1.2 billion or 1.4 almost put together. So for me, my role here is to continue pushing the integration agenda and the message that Africa will be successful, and the African integration agenda can only work if we are to cede a tiny fraction of what we call sovereignty to ensure that we pursue this collective agenda. So if you look at it, is already happening in West Africa. ECOWAS has the Lagos-Abidjan corridor that I think is working very well, and that corridor is going to extend up into Dakar. In Southern Africa, you have similar projects. In Eastern Africa, you have similar projects. What these projects do, they contribute to bringing the markets, and as you know, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the CFTA, as we speak today, is the largest free trade area globally. Once we are able to establish our infrastructure, we respond to our energy challenges, and we train our manpower, this is going to be the continent of the future. And by 2050, we are going to be the largest and the most populous continent in the world, with the youngest population. Whilst other continents and regions and countries are struggling with an aging population, we have an opposite challenge. We have a lot of young people, but the challenge with that is we have to ensure that those young people are trained, they are properly skilled to be able to respond to the market of the 21st century.
And speaking of that challenge, having the youngest population in Africa, and one of the challenges is that as well, is that many of those young people are also leaving the continent for Europe or other parts of the world. And one of the reasons is food and security. And you mentioned about ECOWAS earlier. And looking at currently the ECOWAS region, stability is challenging. And likewise, we've seen in other parts of Africa where, I don't want to name countries, but where the security is challenging for many Africans who are living into that country. So given your background as someone who comes from peace and security role, so what do you think you can play here for Africa to come together, be united, and be that one voice that we need?
I think it's very clear. I have spent my last 15 to almost 20 years working on issues of peace and security across the continent. We have one of the flagships of Agenda 2063, the Silencing the Guns program. We initially had a target of silencing the guns by 2020. Unfortunately, we didn't meet that target. Now we have another target of 2030, which we may struggle to meet that target. But what is clear, and I think what has become obvious to everyone, is that absent peace and security, there will be no development. But at the same time, it is absent development, it's very difficult to also talk about security. So how we manage that, I think, is really the task that we have on our hands. And collectively, we are pushing to ensure that we resolve the conflicts that exist on the continent, whether it is in the Horn of Africa, whether it is in the Sahel that you alluded to, whether it's in the Central African region, or whether it is in the Southern African region. In all these areas, you have pockets of situations that are holding us back. And holding us back in the sense that the insecurity is extremely dangerous and extremely unhelpful for our development trajectory. Now, in order for us to move forward, we have to address what are the drivers of these conflicts. The drivers of these conflicts, quite often we know, is failure to manage diversity in a lot of situations, challenges of inclusivity, but also just responding to some of the basic fundamentals in society, the absence of opportunities for young men and women. And I think we need to be able to see how we respond to that and how we manage politics in our countries in such a way that it's not a winner takes all, that our politics are such that it reflects and it takes forward the wider demographics of the society. When you exclude sections of the society, you are bound to have conflict. So we are working through a holistic approach to say we have to be able to respond to the push factors. You talked about illegal migration or unregulated migration. It's a major challenge. It's very painful when we see news of our young men and women perishing in the desert or those who drown in the Mediterranean. Nobody likes that and nobody likes to see that, and we are quite determined to ensure that we respond to the factors that are pushing these young men and women out of their countries, because nobody wants to leave home voluntarily or involuntarily. They are pushed out because of circumstances beyond their control, and in most cases is the absence of real life opportunities. So we are trying to do that. Now, coming to China, we are working with China very closely, and we are saying to China, as you know, China's policy is not to interfere in the internal affairs of member states, and we are not saying China should interfere or should intervene. But what we are saying to China is, in a situation where the AU or ECOWAS has come up with a roadmap to resolve a particular conflict situation, China should meet us halfway so that we can collectively resolve the situation that we have at hand. Now, what is becoming very clear to the Chinese also, investments, whether it's in agriculture, investments in mining, investments in any sector, are not sustainable if you have conflicts. And I think increasingly we are gaining some traction in our engagements with China on this. And this is done at various levels, at the bilateral level with China, but also in the context of the UN Security Council, where we have UN peacekeeping missions and major global decisions are taken at that level. We work very closely with China as a permanent member with a veto on the UN Security Council to ensure that Africa's priorities and the African agenda at that level is properly articulated and is properly supported by the necessary political and material support that is required.
And just, I will not be doing my job right if I don't ask you these two questions before we end this interview. And one of them is about the African Union's influence. Many people see the African Union as a toothless body. You touched on earlier, like you would want countries like China to support the African Union and the ECOWAS when you make a decision. But not only China, including in Europe and America, you know, most of the time the AU is not considered, even at the United Nations. Currently, Africa is pushing to be one of the permanent security members. What do you think Africa needs to do in order to be considered as a global player where global politics is being played?
We're already doing it, and I think, you know, it is very easy to sit back and criticize, and we accept it. We want to hear from the African citizens on what they think about the African Union. I see the comments, I take them in good faith. Not all the comments, I think, are ill-intentioned. Some of them are born out of frustrations. Nobody wants to find themselves in a conflict situation or in a region that is characterized by continuing challenges. What we are doing is, at the level of the UN Security Council, as you know, we have 3 elected members on a 2-year basis. So what we've done over the years, when I was in New York, we set up what we call the A3, that are the 3 elected African members on the council, working very closely with the AU Peace and Security Council. What is a fact today, which most people might not be aware, is the UN Security Council will hardly take any decision on an African file without consulting with the A3 and reverting back to the AU Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa. This has become the norm, and that was not the case 10, 15 years ago. So yes, our voice is being heard. Do we want it to be louder? Absolutely, and we are working to make it louder. And one way we are doing that, the Caribbean, and the African diaspora, Africa has 5 regions. The 6th region of Africa is the Caribbeans and the diaspora. In the last 5 years, we now have the Caribbean elected members on the Security Council are now joining the A3. So we have what we call the A3 plus. So that caucus, called the A3 plus, has become a formidable force within the Security Council. And like you said, we have the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration that calls for 2 permanent seats with all the privileges, including the veto on the UN Security Council. We are pushing for that. But what you see increasingly is now the African Union, as an institution, is a permanent member, just like the European Union, of the G20. And that was not the case a few years ago. And a good number of African countries are now members of BRICS, and some of them are also members of the G20. But the AU as an institution is now a permanent member of the G20. So yes, the pace might be slow. Yes, we understand the frustrations of our African citizens, and we quite frankly appreciate the criticism, because if we are to close our ears and just think what we do is right, then we have no basis to evaluate what we do. So for me, I think we were very pleased and we are very happy when our African citizens comment and give guidance on some of what we do, because in our quiet moments and in our own reflections, we can then recalibrate as a way of responding to the views of the African citizens.
And finally, for me, you've touched on the diasporans and also the Caribbeans. So I was wondering, what can the African diaspora and global partners support the AU's effort to foster a more equitable and prosperous Africa?
We have a department that is called CIDO, the Citizens and Diaspora Department, that primarily the mandate is to focus on how to harness the African diaspora. On the issue of reparations, you saw Ghana champion the UN resolution and the UN General Assembly on the question of slavery, and it has now been adopted by the UN General Assembly as the gravest crime against humanity in human history. This is an important step. We've been talking about reparations for decades, and there hasn't been any progress.
If I will say, many of those who were responsible abstain.
You can understand why they abstain, because they can see the trajectory and the arrow is pointing in their direction. Because when you then eventually get to the point of talking about reparations, and we're not talking about just financial compensation here, but the moral guilt of what happened, I think will weigh on them, and we are not going to shy away from it. That's why we are very determined and vocal. But back to your question on what the diaspora can do. In the case of China, if you look at what the Chinese diaspora did for the development of this country, 1979 to 2026, they were very instrumental in bringing back the know-how, in bringing back the technology, the experiences, and the knowledge that they have learned from other parts of the world. So we expect the African diaspora here, and it's beyond expectation, we would work towards mobilizing and galvanizing the African diaspora so they can make a meaningful and tangible contribution to the implementation of Agenda 2063. And we see them as an invaluable constituency in what we do. So for my time here, I look forward to strengthening and deepening that partnership with the growing diaspora in China.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bah, for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. Your work is pivotal in shaping the future of Africa-China relations and ensuring that Africa's voice is heard on the global stage. We wish you continued success in your role and look forward to seeing the positive impact of your efforts. Thank you for joining us on Inside the Continent on African Voices Radio.